This is where it happened once again. This is the Roman Forum. Paul would have come through here for sure, but he didn't have a lot of time to do it. There were at least 2 synagogues in this city. One of them was a Samaritan synagogue. You may not have ever thought about that. It was right over here in this area. This is where the Samaritan synagogue would have been, just off the theater, right in here. But there was a Jewish synagogue which has yet to be unearthed. They know it was here. It's described in the Bible. And it was over in this direction because the Jewish quarter was over in that side. It's all under those buildings over there. So that's kind of the layout of the city. On the other side of the theater, way back over there. This was a huge city. In the days of Paul, 100,000 plus people right in this area. And that's, again, just a gigantic city. Now, I'm going to read you the story. I'm going to make some comments. We'll frame this up. And it's going to be like to be continued, which will land us in Berea. Acts chapter 17. Put on your hearing aids. Here we go. Now, when they had passed, oh, by the way, this is just after Philippi. He's left Philippi. We left Philippi. Here comes Paul and Silas and Luke and the other guys, and they're bleeding, the 2 at least, still, I'm sorry to get gross, but scabbed up and hurting, and they move 90 miles from Philippi, making probably 2 or 3 stops along the way until these men come in here, bruised, bleeding, hurting. Can you imagine what it was like when they came into the city and they said, by the way, we got some good news for you? Oh. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, we passed them yesterday, they came to Thessalonica. Here you are, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, over there. Paul went in, as was his custom, on 3 Sabbath days. He reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and rise from the dead, which they didn't think so. He's going to take the sword and throw out the Romans. And saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Messiah. Now, if he's trying to tell them from the Scriptures, what Scriptures do you think he's using? Yeah, the Old Testament, but which Scripture? Anybody got a guess? Isaiah 53. 52 and 53, in fact. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many devout Greeks, and this is important, not a few leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. Apparently Paul was staying with Jason, and Jason, of course, was a Jew, but he was a Greek Jew. And when they could not find them, couldn't find Paul and Silas, they dragged Jason and some of his brothers before the city authorities, shouting. That would have been here. Remember, the agora, wherever the bema was, usually attached to this huge type of an area here, it probably was right in here. So they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities here, shouting, these men, I can't shout, these men who have turned the world upside down. Wouldn't you like to be accused of that?
Yes.
These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. They've heard of them. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, in other words, bail, they let them go. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. That part right there, to be continued. Now, he comes into this city. This city is called a free city. It's not a Roman colony, but it's got this title of a free city because the people of this city helped Mark Antony and Octavius, who eventually became Augustus Caesar, in defeating Brutus and Cassius over in Philippi. That was a civil war. It's a Roman civil war, basically an imperium that's developing versus the republic. And that whole thing of watching, with Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. See, that's the whole incident. And of course it ends with that battle at Philippi where you were yesterday. These people got all the credit for it. But there are some problems here. First of all, the area is in a famine when Paul walks through the door. Did I say the word right? A famine. I said a famine. It's a famine. The people here are starting to starve, so they're not in good condition. Here comes Paul, this beat up, bruised, bleeding guy. He walks in and he goes into the synagogue and he starts preaching during the Sabbaths. He stays here 3 Sabbaths. Now that sounds like 3 weeks, but actually it's 2. One Sabbath to the next Sabbath to the next Sabbath, that's 3, that's 2 weeks. Paul is here less than 3 weeks before they run him out of town. They were upset, the synagogue leaders were upset for the same reasons they'd been upset over in Asia Minor. Paul is preaching a gospel, first of all, that you had a suffering Christ. They didn't believe it because even though Paul tried to reason with them from the scriptures, they didn't search the scriptures to find out what's really going on with the Messiah. That goes into part 2 when we get to Berea. Secondly, Paul is telling the people that the synagogue that the Gentiles are allowed into the kingdom and they don't have to become Jews first. We're back to that subject. Remember, that's what got the Essenes mad, the Hellenized Essenes, at the people in Philippi. That's what caused the Judaizers in Galatia to act. It's not that they hated Paul. They hated the idea of someone saying that the Gentiles could become Christians before becoming Jews because they felt that being a Christian was just being part of another Jewish sect. Therefore, you can't tell someone to come in and fellowship with us and be one of us without becoming a proselyte or a converted Gentile into Judaism first. I remind you, keeping kosher, doing the ceremonial laws, getting circumcised, all of that. The council at Jerusalem took care of that. Stop being a pagan, you're welcome to come in. But the reaction of the synagogues was explosive, and that's what happened here. Secondly, the city officials are alarmed because, remember, not a few prominent women joined in. Those few prominent women, there's not a few rather, this is a lot of prominent women in this world. The Greco-Roman world, they have a tremendous amount of influence because they have a lot of money. Money always buys influence. Suddenly the women are saying, and these are Gentile women, they're pagans. They're saying, wow, this message is true. They are, as it were, coming forward at the altar calls. That's a modern invention, of course, but you get the idea. And the local officials are going, hey, this is trouble. This is trouble. Why is it trouble? Because they're joining a Jewish sect? Not so much. Because Paul is saying there is another king. And this city is extremely loyal to Caesar. They're steeped in Caesar worship. They love Caesar. I'm not going to take the time to read it, but even in my notes that I took on this place, there's an oath that the people would swear to Caesar. Maybe we can read it on the bus as we're going from this city, that they would rather die than denounce Caesar as Lord. And now Paul comes in and he's preaching Jesus as Lord. He's raised the ire of the synagogue leaders, the local officials, and now the rabble that the synagogue puts together because they say, how are we going to get rid of this guy? This is becoming popular. In just 2 weeks' time, lots of people are saying, we want to follow Christ. And a lot of them don't even really know who he is, except that the offer of salvation by grace through faith with the atonement of sin and a heaven that they never even dreamed of. You want that? Yeah, we do, because paganism never gave us any of that. Paganism is what we do. The gods, if they exist, are capricious and they're going to play tricks on you. This is a God that truly loves you. That's their situation when they come here, and that's why they got run out of town in less than 3 weeks. Now, 2 more things. First of all, the Thessalonians, when Paul runs out of town, forgive me, he sends Timothy back. Watch out for these guys, help them out. Establish leaders. Now, I don't know about you, but Pastor Mike and Pastor Keo, we don't just say, look, we've been here 3 weeks, let's ordain pastors. We just don't do that. So they found the wisest, most dedicated men, devout men to the Lord, who would also come to faith that Jesus is the Messiah. And they laid hands on them and made them elders, just that quick. But Paul is smart, and he sends Timothy back. And he says, Timothy, when you get the chance, come and tell me. So along the way, Timothy comes back here, and he begins to tell these people what's going on. In the meantime, they're being persecuted because they're worshiping another king, Jesus, and the people here don't like it, and they're angry anyway because there's a famine in the land, and they're frustrated, they're hurting. You can tell just by looking at Thessalonica, Thessaloniki today, that there's a great deal of frustration about the economics of the land and all of that, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. But these people were angry because they were already agitated. And now you're talking about abandoning the gods. We talked about that before. You turn your back on the gods, they get mad at you. There's earthquakes and fires and famines and plagues and everything else. And maybe it's your fault that we're having a famine. It could be even that. And yet, in just the short time that Paul was here, he ends up going from here to Berea, and then from Berea down to Athens. This is what we have recorded, and we're following that route. And then from Athens to Corinth. We don't know really how long all that took, but we're guessing about 6 months. By the time he ends up in Corinth, about 6 months along, he eventually writes the first letter he wrote, 1 Thessalonians. It's not that it's listed first, it's way back in his letters, but as far as anybody can tell, the first letter that Paul wrote was to the people here, and he wrote it from Corinth. The second letter Paul wrote was 2 Thessalonians, once again writing it from Corinth not long after he wrote the first letter. And he wrote it in response to Timothy returning. Here's what's going on. All right, I'm going to write them and encourage them. It wasn't for another 5 years that he wrote his next letters. This place was dear to him. He loved the people here. We look at Paul as sort of a harsh man. I would have loved to have heard him speak just to figure out how he came across to the people. It would have been really interesting. Eusebius, who lived 300 years later, has a very weak description of him that we don't know is true. But he said he was short, bald, hunched over, squinty eyes, a hook nose, very thin, and talked in a high, squeaky voice. Maybe that was Paul. But that's 300 years later he gives this description. You think, man, Paul was a harsh guy, and you look at him getting in Barnabas's face, and you look at him rebuking other officials. And then you read 1 Thessalonians, and you find something out about him. And it's this. He was being accused of doing what he was doing here for pride, honor, and money. They would lie about him under any circumstances just to discredit the man's teaching when he came in and then was driven out of town. See, he left not because we threw him out of town, because there was no money here. They would lie. And he said in chapter 2, verse 8, that he said that when we were among you, we loved you so much that we were, now listen, this is in 2 weeks' time, we were not content to share with you the gospel only, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. We were among you like a mother with a nursing child, and this is how he characterizes it. When he said you would become so dear to us, there's a very interesting connotation in it. It's an idiomatic phrase. Don't just get into the Greek, get into the idioms. We've talked a little bit about that because it was something that clicked with them, something that maybe they only understood. The idiomatic phrase, you would become so dear to us. When they heard that, they heard the type of dearness, and God forbid that any of you have ever experienced this. The way that a mother would cradle a dead child. That dear. It's an extremely deep word. The most deep emotions that you could have. And this is what he communicates to the people here. That's how dear they had become to them. But here's the other side of the coin. And maybe this part is for me and for Pastor Mike and Pastor Keo, but I think it's for all of us. Everybody in a church who is a born-again, Spirit-filled follower of Jesus Christ is commissioned to minister with whatever God has given you to minister. But he doesn't want us to just do duty. We do have a Christian duty, that's true. But what heart did Paul give us the example and teach the Thessalonians in which to discharge that duty? That we loved you so much that we were not content just to bring you the gospel, but we gave you our lives as well, like a mother with a nursing child. You were so dear to us. What does a nursing child have to give back to a mother? Nothing. Nursing children just take, but mothers love it. Mothers love it. Paul said that's us. And that's ministry. That's your ministry. That's pastoral ministry. That is all our ministry. You go to the church and you say, I don't like some of the people here. Or we church hop and church shop. They didn't have that option back then. You had to reconcile and make good with the people around you. You just didn't go from place to place because you got mad at somebody and I don't want to be there anymore. Remember, God gave us the means to reconcile with each other through Jesus, to him and to each other. Breaking of bread, you guys know this. We have a message. We have a task. We have gifts. We have what God has given to us. But in what heart do we give it? Same heart as Jesus. For God so loved. And that right there is something to pray about. We loved you so much that we were not content to share with you the gospel only, but our lives as well, because you would become so dear to us. And he wanted to go back. Even in the face of all the opposition, which didn't die down, they chased him out the gates of the city, so to speak. They had to leave clandestinely. But when they found out they went to Berea, they sent a mob to Berea. What does Paul want to do? He wants to come back. And twice he tried to get here. It's not known if he ever made it, but he wanted to come back. He loved these people. That's ministry. That's a pastor. That's a Christian. That's a person with something that God has given them to give to others. No matter who they are, no matter how low you might think you are, or how high you might think you are, no matter whether you think you have a personality that's conducive to it or not, God made you the way he made you so that you would be the glove in which he puts his hand and soothes the world through the salvation of Jesus. Isn't that amazing? Right here. Just a little more than 2 weeks, and it was here.